Sam, you can take it away with your Andrena thing. Oh, the one other thing is thank you. I forgot off the top of my head who it was, but thank you for sending me some of your table of contents for some of the classes that you've gone to. Very helpful. I'll keep taking those. Timestamps are fantastic. Or if you have students that are going through these and making their own lists, let me know. Could really use them. They're for the good of all. Okay, now I'll stop talking.
Okay. I will share, but what we're going to be talking about today are a delightful group of 6 eastern species that have black faces. In other words, there's no yellow or white on the clipius, and have a distinct tooth on the base of the mandible. I have a shot. I'm going to share that right now so we can orient to what I'm talking about. If you see this tooth, which is very easy to see in the males and very difficult to see in the females, as you'll find out. Okay, let me just focus for a second to get this sharing. If you see that tooth, you've narrowed your answer down quite a bit. All right, so we're looking at right now one of them, Andrena cornelli, and I think you can already see. So this is sort of like what you might see, but not as quite as dramatic in megachile, where you have at the base there's a spike coming down. In megachile, it's much longer, and sometimes it's absent in there. In the case of Andrena, it's mostly absent. In other words, this is just a smooth mandible edge. But in a few species, for some reason, I don't know what the purpose would be here, this tooth is present and obvious if you look for it, right? So if you're not looking at the base of the mandible, you're not going to see it. So often I just pick it up. Every once in a while, I'm keying something through, and then I go, oh, wait a minute. It's got a, let me look at the man, and there it is. So, you learn over time the names of some of these species with the teeth. So in the east, there's 6, and in the west, there's more. They all have this. This is not a character of Andrena sensu strictu, which they are all part of that subgenus that's currently defined. So other members like Carolina and Frigida have no mandibular tooth, but there is a group of them and they are all in the subgenus for what that's worth. So in Discover Life, because this is such an obvious character, we drop everything, and then the rest of the characteristics of the species are often subtle. There's a couple of cases like milwaukeensis is pretty easy to identify without looking at the tooth first, but other species, they all kind of look very similar, so they're all taken care of in one couplet. So, and I thought I had it up here, and maybe it has shifted. Let me just do a find rufosignata. That's good. There we go. Okay, so let's see. Let me make this a little bigger. Remove this icon out of the way. So it's a pretty onerous looking couplet, but it will become your friend very quickly. So of these 6, 3 of them have entirely pale hair on their face, and 3 have some dark hairs. Usually those dark hairs are not omnipresent. In other words, not all dark hair. Usually the dark hairs line, and we'll look at this, line the edge of the eye, the inside of the eye. And so we'll tackle species that have all pale hairs. We're not going to look to see, oh yes, they all have pale hairs, because that's still predominantly what a face of all 6 of these would look like. Pale. On inspection, you'll see these dark hairs in 3 of them, and that takes us to an entirely different group. So if we look at cornelli, which we have on deck under the microscope, you'll see a set of characters here that are helpful in separating cornelli from the other, in this case, 2 other species, which would be macoupinensis and mandibularis. very conveniently, alphabetically, all in the same place too. And there are several things that are useful. So with cornelli, I'll highlight the first first flagellar segment, the first flagellar segment or first flagellomere. Boy, I'm having problems here. As particularly long as compared to the second flagell F2 and I'm just going to go with F2 and F1. So the comparison between those, and when we're looking at macoupinensis, which has other characters, it's about the same. So 1.5 to 1.75, 1.25 to 1.5. Hard to differentiate those two. But mandibularis, this is the main way of separating cornelli from mandibularis, which is that they are about equal in mandibularis. So this is a very nice character. That's a pretty big difference in the scheme of things. So the other thing, just some facts here. Some of these are specialists. So cornelli is a specialist on rhododendrons. So those would be the native rhododendrons. They seem to turn their nose up at the weird Himalayan hybrid types of species. We've never seen them on there. But if you know the native rhododendrons, they often have a large butterfly, let's call it, avenue of pollen transmission philosophy, and their stamens stick way out there, right? Which you would think would be not a great thing for bees unless you are a small bee like Andrena cornelli and you just crawl out to the end and grab that pollen at the end of the stamens. Otherwise, they're looking for, inviting tiger swallowtails and things to come. That's the plant that is. Anyway, so that's another thing. Like if you're in an area with the rhododendrons, this species may show up. It's probably less likely than the female to show up on the plant because it's gathering nectar from maybe other sources, but it's going to be around. It's going to be in a woodland setting. And they show up in cities pretty regularly. Like I've captured these in the National Arboretum right in the heart of Washington, D.C. And I wouldn't be surprised, although I'm not sure there's been any kind of effort to look at this, to find them in any kind of habitat within an urban area that has these native rhododendrons. I think that would be an interesting study. Okay, so let's focus on this. So we're saying first flagellar F1 is a lot longer than F2. And we have some other issues here. So we've noted that the face is entirely pale. The malar space 1 to 2 times wider than the eye margin. So, not nothing. When we look elsewhere, S6 does not have the long hair that we'll talk about under macoupinensis. And so together that forms a good way of separating these out. So let's go to our specimen now. So there's a tooth again. Now we need to zoom in, and maybe we can do that with the current setup. It's a little bit off, but you can already see that this is fairly long compared to that, but we can't see the end, so I want you to see that. So I'm going to turn the specimen around and run the specimen like this. Ooh, I have made it very small for some reason. Okay. So we zoom here. And to orient, it's at a little bit of an angle, but I think this is dramatic enough that you can still see the difference. So here's the pedicel right here. So the ball joint of the antenna, and the scape is below it, a little bit dark, perhaps. Here's F1, there's the joint, here's F2. I'm going to have to play with the magnification quite a bit. So we're not looking at it at completely at right angles. Maybe I'll do that just to be complete. So you want to, if you don't look at it at right angles, of course, it foreshortens the antennae. Who wants that? Okay, better-ish. Let me just angle it this way a little bit too. Okay. So we're talking about 1.5 to 1.75 times. So here is the length. Here is F2. And you can see that this one is clearly longer than that one. Now, when we go to mandibularis, these will be roughly the same length. And so those two characters, the three, the tooth plus the pale hairs plus the antennae give you cornelli. We're going to take a look, though, at the last sternite area where the genitalia poke out and other things happen to give you a contrast with macoupinensis, which does have a long first flagellar segment, but it has a very different aspect to what's going on here. I don't feel like I need to spend a bunch of time. It's just the usual straight hairs back here. It's possible that and I don't know for sure, I could take a quick look because it's hard to see in the hairs, that the end of the S6 is upturned. It turned up at right angles. In this view, of course, it would be turned down if you were looking at it be in regular format. But that's not of significance. They either all have it or they all don't. I can't even tell from here. But what I want you to see is that these hairs are reasonably normal, pointing straight back, nothing to see. So let's go now to mandibularis, which is a species that shows up quite a bit in forested environments. Again, I have not heard if, or maybe I'm not recalling, that it has a plant specialization associated with it. It's possible it does, and it's always possible given how little, you see if I want to choose the right one here, how little we know about life histories of many bee species. Anyway, it's the most common of the pale-haired ones, at least in our region. My specimens are a little goopy. That's good enough. We're really just going to be looking at the antennae. We're not going to essentially look for anything other than pale hairs because that's all it has. So we don't need to document its absence. I get the angle right here for a good antenna comparison shot. It looks pretty good. Turn it down. There is our bee. Yes, there's so many natural history things to do here. I'm going to up the lighting on this a little bit. Feel like it's a little dark. And let's go to at least 200. That seems reasonable. So we're going to focus, and I'm going to pull the specimen towards us a little bit. Okay, so we're looking at F1 versus F2 in this case again. And what we see is that these two are much closer to each other. It could be 1.25. I don't think it's exactly the thing, but it's a much closer ratio of lengths of this segment and this segment. So that's the key on mandibularis. We'll just take a look at its underside here.
Mandibularis or macoupinensis?
No, this is mandibularis.
All right.
Mandibularis, I mean, macoupinensis will have a much greater ratio of, where the heck is, there we go. Much greater ratio between the two. In other words, it's going to be close to what we saw in cornelli. So the genitalia is sticking out a bit out of here, but again, we have basically no particularly different hair pattern down here in the underside. So these are the turites, these are the sternites. Genitalia is poking out here, but what you see is mostly a bunch of straight hairs. Okay, so let's jump now to the last of our pale-faced, toothed members of Andrena sensu stricto. And this one, interesting how these things work. This one is, let me find a good specimen, is a willow specialist. So how did it become a willow specialist when the others are not? Is interesting. And I'm looking in particular at the rear end to try and, oh, there we go. That's good. Okay. Oh, but that doesn't have a head. So let's see if we can find something. We may have to put things together. That one has a head. Well, I might have to do two. So because without a head, we can't tell anything, but this has a good non-goopy shot. In other words, there's no extra material sitting on the, get it just right, sitting on the tip of the abdomen that will hide what it is we're trying to look at. Maybe from this direction, we'll get a better shot. This small, so there we go. That's going to be good. So what we're looking at now is S6, slight angle. And what we're looking for is this sort of, as you can read in Discover Life, some kind of like little, what did I describe it? A little bonnet-like area of very tightly curled hairs, like almost like a little wig. So you see right here, so these were in the other species very straight, and here we have this very curled over clump of hairs right at the tip. And try and get a slightly different angle here on this. So it projects out quite a bit too. So if we were looking in the laterally along the edge, there's a bunch of things in the way, so we really can't quite do this. This becomes even more prominent. So that doesn't occur in any of the other species, including the dark-haired ones. And plus, with the association with willows, you have a pretty good chance of spotting this one. I believe we can take a look that look on our specimen that does have a head. And what we should see, first of all, I think it has maybe the largest tooth of all of them, although that's not something that's in the guide, but just noticing that. And it has quite a long antenna segment comparison relative to mandibularis. All right, let's see if we can see again these segments on the antenna. And then we'll look at the mandible. Where is that specimen? What's that, an angle? That should be this way. There we go. Get the face, get the antennae. We'll leave it on this side. Okay, so, okay, here is escape. That's the pedicel. This is F1 here, and then this is F2. So you can see this is much longer than F2. So I think we say 1.25 to 1.5 times that length. And the face has all white hairs, and I'll show you the tooth here if I can. And you can see maybe one of these others has a less obstructed head. Tend to bend all over the place. This one might work. So this is one of several species of willow specialists. I don't know that there are any others within the Andrena sensu strictu. I could be wrong. Maybe frigida, if I recall. Like 8 to 12 species in the East that are specialists. You can see the tooth over here already that's quite large. Let me see if I can get it into view. I have this little suspicion that if we looked more closely at willows, now we would find that, because there's many different species, some, we have in the East, we have the black willow, which is there might be more going on in the I'm a willow specialist book than meets the eye. So they may be partitioning early and late willows, for example. All right, so we're just taking a quick look here at the relatively massive size, sort of a insider look at the mandible. It's a little bit, it's a comparison. Maybe I should put it in there, but you can see that this tooth is, if we recall the cornelli, this tooth is wider and broader and extending further down, and that seems to be a general character of the species. But you can do it with antennal segments, and it has that nice little muff at the bottom of its abdomen on the sternites. It's good to have several things to look at because sometimes these things are occluded. Okay, so that ends our trip to the pale-faced toothed mandibled species, and now we'll get to the ones that have a bit of black hair. So as you go north, you get more milwaukeensis and rufosignata, and but you still get a lot of tridens. Down where we are, they're all three occur in Maryland, and therefore the Mid-Atlantic, but I associate both rufosignata and milwaukeensis mostly with the western parts of the state. All right, I'm trying to get a good specimen here that is not a female and appear to be rich in females. Okay, here's a male. Okay, this will work. So first thing we're going to do is just look for these black hairs. So like I said, the specimen as a whole at first glance would appear to be pale-faced, but upon inspection, you will see black hairs along, I think for all of them, lining the inside of the eye. Got a lot of bright stuff going on here.
Which one are you starting off with?
This is tridens.
Heard.
Right. So bright. I think that is the specimen there. Get it? And so we're looking laterally because that's the best. Sometimes these dark hairs are partially translucent, so it can become hard to see, hard to detect, particularly if you're looking at the hairs. We're at high magnification now. You're looking at the hairs straight down because behind it is black integument. So it's sometimes difficult to tell what's going on. So here you can see there's white. This is not a pristine specimen by any means, but you can see that along the edges here, as I dial the focus in and out, you can see that particularly towards the top of the head, there's a series of black hairs. If it was more pristine, I think these may be black too. Again, a little bit of a question, but you can see pretty clearly where the marker is, the cursor, that there are a series of black hairs, and then something else is going on the interior, and there are white hairs. Note here it's not part of the ID string, but they have very wide cheeks. And you can see they come to a point, and that is a general character, but a bunch of Andrena have that. Okay, so if we look here is another big tooth, shorter, but apparently broader than some of the others. So let's jump back. Okay, so that's just some orientation. So now we're going to go to the last three here. So milwaukeensis, rufosignata, and tridens. I have tridens up because tridens is the one that I see the most. But I have specimens of the other two, I believe, for males and not just females. So we have the dark hairs that put it into that group. Malar space. I usually am not using malar space, but apparently it helps separate out some of these. We'll perhaps take a look at the other two species. The first flagellar segment is about 1.2 to 1.5, so it is definitely longer than the second, but not by gazillions. And S6, so here we have a unique character. So abdomen S6, in that the apex is strongly reflex. Oh, maybe that's it. The others don't have a reflexed or bent edge to S6. So like we were talking about, we'll try and detect this. The last segment of the S6 is, as we say here, like a piece of sheet metal. The center is strongly concave, leaving the sides projecting into two rounded dog-like lobes, and the hairs are not like macoupinensis. So let's see if we can find that. I have to have a specimen that has an abdomen, which apparently, even though I have quite a few specimens, abdomens seem to be, and nails seem to be in short supply here. So it is possible that we will not get to see that lovely character. But is this a male? No, another female. I don't know what this one. Another female. I just scan the box here. I may not have saved any of the males or given them away. These all appear to be lovely females. So we'll be in good shape for that. This is, though, the character that we're talking about is a common character within Andrena, so it should be at least a little, oops, nope, that's a female. And that is a female. So that character of the upturned nature of the S6 is something that should be familiar to an Andrena worker. Yeah, I don't have any males unless they're in another box. Okay, so that combination, well, actually, this is unique, right? So you have a tooth, you have the dark hairs, but I believe this is the only one. It does say unique, so that would be unique to this entire other set of the, instead of the S6 being simply flat or slightly sloping, it's got this sharp upturned apex with ears, dog-like ears. In other words, so the rim of that upturned segment is not just a straight rim like you would do with a piece of sheet metal, right? You would bend it, but instead it has projecting ear-like lobes on either side. Again, this is something that shows up in species and specimens for other groups very commonly. All right, so let's tackle milwaukeensis. So milwaukeensis can be quite common in particularly in the north. And so it has the dark hairs running on the inside of the eyes. We can take a look for that, but it does say sometimes these hairs are absent. I don't have that much familiarity with the species, but you'll see these other characters are um, pretty good. Oh, it's saying malar space 2 or more times greater, so it's got quite a large in comparison. Malar space, we'll take a look at that. And then the first flagellum is 1.5 times as long. We've seen that before. S6 is prow-like and slightly elevated. So in other words, it's not bent. Long hair is present, but not like macoupinensis. And then this is the character. So segments T 3 through 5. So the tergites 3 through 5 and sternites S through 5 covered in short dark hairs. So the other species have only these pale hairs. So let's pull a specimen. Hopefully I have males of milwaukeensis here. It does look like that. And we can see, so what we're looking for, we don't really need to look at the tooth anymore because we know what that looks like. But what we want to see is these short dark hairs on the tergites. So I think this will be a good angle. Oops, I have a specimen from tridens still on the clay piece. So if we put that there, we're going to go to, we'll look at the malar space too, because it's always good to look at malar spaces. So if we go to this down and also tends to be some oranginess often associated with the pale hairs on the scutum. In the female, it's even more pronounced. But that's again a hint of things, not really absolute. So you can see this in the tergites, I think, better than the sternites. Let me just focus on the transition area. So here's T1, T2, T3, 4, 5, and even from here with things not quite in focus, you can see that you have long pale, now you have short dark hairs. Now I'm going to jack it up to higher magnification. Theoretically, that should be also mirrored on the sternites. Perhaps not so dramatically. So these are hard. Again, we're looking at these kinds of things from the side, but you can see here's the pale hairs up here from the previous segments. And now we've moved from those into, we're at high magnification here. So we're looking at very short hairs, but they're very clearly dark. Even in these pictures, you can see that, I think. And they go down, I believe, to 3, 4, 5, maybe at T345. I believe they also said they should be able to see this. Oops. On the sternites, it looks like the sternites have white hair bands, and then I'm looking here and see down here some dark hairs away from the rim on the main body of the segment. The stuff on the tergites is, I think, easier to see. But once you have it in hand, maybe it isn't. Maybe you can see them more regularly here. But I think you can discern that some of those hairs are dark underneath. So that's the primary way of detecting that species. And let's see if its malar space is available to us. So it is larger than others, but not by a whole heck of a lot. So again, when you just have one specimen, it's hard to use a character that is that close to another specimen. So yes, here's the mandible edge, here's the eye. You can see there is a pretty broad patch there. And the way to use these kinds of characters that are close is if you had a collection and you had several specimens of dark-haired, toothed, mandibled specimens, and you had a question about whether they were different or not. You can do things like, okay, well, we know the malar spaces are sometimes useful. What's going on? And you just go back and forth until you feel satisfied. So identification wise, you don't really have to linger on the malar space and things or the antennal segments because you have much better characters. Sometimes they're not available, so you may have to visit some of these things. So let's go to our last one, also a dark-haired one, and one we see in the Appalachians. It's more common to the north. Let's see if I have any males. I have female, female, female. I don't have very many specimens, and I'm looking here, and they're all females. We can look at them in a second when we get to the females. But let's go to the guide and just look at this. So dark hairs, yes. Malar space distinctly longer than twice the eye margin. So it's theoretically it has a very long, and the females do have a longer head and quite a broad eye margin. Useful in comparison, difficult to just use when you only have one specimen and no comparative material to other species. First flagellar segment about equal or slightly longer than second, so that's pretty distinct, and about as long as the third. So it's different from the other two in the lengths of the ratios of the first and second flagellum layers. And S6 doesn't have a tuft of hairs and is flat. So again, should be relatively straightforward, although we don't have any specimens here to tell from the others. Okay, so we have now, what time is it, Claire?
We are at excuse me, we're at 1:41.
Okay.
I was trying to look through all of our Discover Life pictures, see if we could have any comparisons.
Yeah. So we can now jump over and look at the females and start on that. I don't think we'll finish. And so we'll do a little trick here and just change males to females in the guides. And if are there any questions about the males at this point?
Not yet, but why don't we give it a second to see if somebody can put something in the chat or say things with their words.
I'll jump
You're welcome to
to,
unmute. So was our ID strength for rufosignata basically it's not the other six or the other five?
um, well, it's got dark hair, so that takes it down to 3.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other 2 have very distinct features, right? The
Right.
tridens has the upturned, downturned, whatever you want. S6, very, very distinct. And then milwaukeeensis has the short black hairs on the tergites and the sternites, and the others have no black hairs whatsoever. So
Yep.
that leaves it.
So it's
So
just not those. It doesn't have anything special about it. Just
yes, there is no
not its
unique
friends.
thingy
Got it.
thing, although it seemed to have a long a long malar space, although again, that's pretty comparative. So I wouldn't even necessarily you bet the farm on that one. All right, should we go to the females?
Sure enough.
Let's go to mandibularis just because it's common and it often gets messed up. So now all of a sudden we're unhinged from a, a grouping, a natural grouping for the same species in the females. They, they fall out in with other species that aren't necessarily even the same subgenus because there's no obvious tooth. So mandibularis is an interesting one. So here's rufosignata and mandibularis, but also Carolina, which is also Andrena sensu-stricto group, and Thasbii, which I'm not sure if it is a sensu-stricto group, but it's falling out there. So let's just look at mandibularis. So what we're seeing is when you look at them, you notice that they have a big broad head and the fovea are relatively wide too. So let's see what else. There's a moderate malar area and label process entire. So some of the others have, instead of a label process that's entire, in other words, it's one smooth line, they have a break in it. So it's either a little bit concave, a lot of bit concave, or even bidentate, we would call it, or toothed. And then here's this thing. So mandible with tiny tooth. So when you go through, I don't know if LaBerge uses this as much, but Mitchell does. And they'll talk about, well, you differentiate this because it has a tooth on the mandible. So let me grab, and that is just really vague. So let me grab a female mandibularis and we'll look at this supposed tooth and you'll see it is nothing at all like the males. And its use is, and therefore a little bit ambiguous. And in comparison, like if you had a long set of specimens or a lot of experience, you might be able to use this, but otherwise it's like, can you really do this? Oops. Specimen is too low on the ground. Stick the head of the pin in the clay. Let's try this. All right, so jump back to the screen and nope, that's the clay. And there's the specimen. So a lot of these have dark facial fovea, which is a good sort of, because many species do not have that. So this one does. And we're looking at the man. It is just so not anything to write home about. And so I think relatively difficult to, I mean, I'm putting my glasses on to really like fine. In fact, I may be wrong here. This may be the muscle attachment to the mandible. Here's a malar space, right? Yeah, there we go. That's a little bit better. This, I think, is a muscle attachment or a condyle. In other words, if you think about a mandible, so it flaps back and forth. So there is so it wouldn't be a muscle attachment. Muscle attachments in mandibles are in the middle, slightly offset, so that it has a leverage to swing it open and closed. And then there's attachments on the edges, like hinges, really. Otherwise, how would you do that? So they do it by having these condyles we're really getting off the topic here, but that's a condyle and that's a condyle and that's a muscle attachment. It's not in the middle, it's offset so that it can have some leverage to open up the thing. This is probably as is the theoretical tooth. So it is really that is very difficult to see, I think, but it's used in there and is very subtle. So let's go back to the guide and see what we say. So mandible with, so we don't even lead off with that. Mandible with a very tiny tooth, tiny tooth, and near the inferior articulation of the mandible. This tooth usually there, but difficult to spot. So that's not great. Facial fovea. So remember, we're just doing this comparison between the small group. We have very long-faced Carolina, and we have a relatively, as long and as broad, so kind of a square quadrangle rather than a long face like Carolina, which is a specialist on ericaceous flowers, which makes sense. You would want a long schnoz to get in there. And then the others here we have rufosignata, which would be the one that often leads to confusion. And we'll look at that next. Facial quadrille as broad as long. So same as basically it's got not a long narrow head. And malar space area long more than 1/4 as long as broad. So there's a pretty significant malar space. Labral process emarginate, okay, to bidentate. So that's your ticket, whereas here, labral process entire. Okay, so that's going to be the way. There's some vibe that differs between the two, but it's they have tricked me in the past. So, and also, so Carolina has really long mandibles, and when they close, they extend way past the other mandible and past the free end of the clypeus. So so Carolina relatively easy, and these are pretty similar. Rufosignata it does not have unusually long mandibles. And it says mandible with or without a small tooth. So again, this tooth thing mentioned elsewhere is not really useful, I think. And so facial fovea with hair is usually dark brown to black and upper half or more. And what did we say? I think for whatever reason, I am not seeing a mention. Usually we parallel structure all this, but the facial fovea is for mandibularis. We'll take a look. Maybe it is all pale. And Thaspi, we're just going to ignore the other species for the moment. Thaspi, I believe, is another tricky one, labral process bidentate. So let's look here at our female that we have under the microscope of mandibularis. Again, a much more common species that we see, I believe, throughout the state in woodlands. So these are species that really don't exist after the spring, and they don't really even probably much leave the woods, although you see that happening. For example, there's a blooming woody plant outside of the woodlands. You can collect these woodland species sometimes. Another murky area in need of work is like, what is the relationship of woods and open areas surrounding those woods for some of these species we know are associated with woodlands. So mandibles, not super long, tongue architecture sticking out. Clypeus, here's the rim of the clypeus. The labrum is mostly tucked under these mandibles, but here's the labral process, which is used a lot in identification of many species, but particularly Andrena. So here, when we say entire, it means that there is no break of any kind from a simple, smooth swoop of the margin. So sometimes you say it's entire, sometimes it's simple. Anyway, there it is, pretty obvious. Okay, so let's look at the, I'm curious now about the facial fovea. So facial fovea, looking at facial fovea and getting color sometimes is tricky because there's optical illusions going on with those hairs, and that sometimes you look at one angle and it's dark and another angle it's light. So that's another reason to hold specimens in your fingers and shade them back and forth. And as usual, we have a bunch of hair in the system. So I can't really see what's going on here. It does appear like the top is dark. In general, this group, at least rufosignata and mandibularis, have pretty wide tops to their facial fovea. I'm not going to concentrate on that because that's not a key character. So let's jump to rufosignata, of which I do have some females. Find a reasonably good one. And, you know, one thing, Claire, I wonder if the group, since they're all bee people, want a day of discussion of techniques of any kind that are not just ID techniques, but like survey techniques and bowl trapping and processing specimens and things like that. I'm not sure we ever have done that. Like, how do we go from something in soapy water to a good-looking specimen, some of which we fail at because you can see our specimens sometimes don't look good. And I wonder if that's something that maybe we should think about, and thinking off the top of my head.
It's a good idea. It's that time of year when people are planning projects, hopefully now instead of April.
Yeah. All right. That's a pretty good one. Let's see if I have a slightly better one. So when we talk about things that are emarginate and bidentate, it can be a little tricky. So I should have done this on the mandibularis one, but I'm going to do it on this rufosignata one right now, which is at some angles, the labor process can look entire. In other words, simple, unbroken. And then and I'm going to show that to you. And then we'll go back to mandibularis and see if we see anything. I don't think we will. How you can be tricked. And then when you change the angle so that, where the heck is, there we go. When you change the angle so that you're looking, so you can kind of see that there's a lot of darkness in the facial fovea area. I'll just focus it there. But again, like I say, sometimes the angle that you're looking at obscures it. So if we look here, a quick look at this label process. So in orientation, here's the edge of the clypeus. This is the labral process. Labrum is running down below and behind the mandibles. This looks simple, looks entire. And we saw the same angle and we came to that same conclusion on the other one, but there's a little something going on here. And now though, if we change the angle, this again, why you use your fingers to hold specimens. If we change that angle, then we can see, you know, you wish You would wish that bees did not do this kind of thing, but constantly throwing things at you. This is maybe too much of an angle, but let's see what we can get out of this. Yeah, that's can't really even see that one really well. Why is that? Let me just look.
If you want to zoom back in, the way that
Mhm.
you describe this bidentate with rufosignata is labral process marginate to bidentate. Be sure to look on the front face of the labral process, as this is the location where you'll find the usually relatively small half circular cutout, if that description helps.
Okay, I think I've got the angle on this better now. But again, there we go. There we go. Okay. So if I turn it too far, it goes away. So there's a Clypeus rim. We were looking down on it, straight down, and what's going on is there's a bend to the, or an edge perhaps, to the labral process, and underneath there's a very nice emargination, and you can imagine it as highly emarginate or bidentate. A little bit difficult to see. Maybe I'm gonna, you know what, I'm gonna change the lighting so we can catch that a little bit better. But this is where I'm going. Then some of these bidentate species, an angle that does not is not like this misses the bidentate nature of it. Okay, where I need to drop out of this, go to here, and let's pump this up to 400. It's a little bit better. Oops. Okay, so you can see it a little bit better here. You can see, again, this is the labral process right here. The labrum is all this stuff going on further down. Actually, the mandibles are out. So if we went further, you could see more of the labrum. But largely ignore the rest of it because it's mostly hidden. When these mandibles close, you can't see this bottom part, but the labral process is always visible. So in this case, you have to tilt the specimen over to see the emargination right there. Some interesting little tufts of hairs there. So that is the case with rufosignata. Now let's see if there's anything else going on there. And we're right at 2, so we'll stop. But let's just see if there's anything else that it says. Mallar space, long, more than 1/4 as long as broad. We'll just look at that. I don't know what the comparisons. See, these others, one moderate, 1/4 as long, slightly less. These other species, mandibularis, Mallar space moderate, 1/4 as long or slightly less. So they all have pretty significant. This is the different one. It has a whacking big malar area, relatively long, 1/4 or more. Oh, it does say 1/4 or more. Okay, well, the last thing we'll do is look at the malar space, and anyone has a question can tee that up with Claire. It's very highly. Let's see, I need to turn it, I think.
We do have a
And
question in the chat to see, could we see where the mandibular tooth would be on the female,
right.
even if it doesn't have a clear
Okay.
one?
Yeah, yeah. Good point. All right. Oh, this will show us both things, theoretically. So if you recall what it says, may or may not have a mandibular tooth, but we can look at that area. And trying to resolve this. I'm not quite sure of the boundary here. I see what looks like the two condyles and the muscle attachment. This looks like very long malar space. So theoretically, it's a quarter of the mandibular length. This looks more like at least half. I'm going to ignore that because we may have a bad specimen, but the tooth-wise, so here's the mandible where this is the underside, right? So where the tooth would be, and we're at high power. This is probably the condyle right here. I'm pretty sure because that looks like it. That looks like the muscle attachment. So the mandibular tooth is, and that's different from the infamous lamellae, which is we don't use very much, but is something that people that there are differences between the species, but it's a lot of times very difficult to see because the mandibles are closed. So when we look here, the place to look for a tiny tooth would be right in this area. Is that bump a tooth? Is that a tooth, or is that part of the attachment area? I don't know. I basically it's clearly not like the males, and so I don't really see anything going on in there myself. But that's where you would look. Base of the mandible, underside of base of the mandible, yeah, and eye attachment, and on the underside. But you have to ignore the attachment point because that's going to be bump-like. Any other
As far as
questions?
something that might be affected by this mandibular or the, sorry, I'm reading this from the malar space. From LaBerge, it says the clipius more vaulted and longer than either mandibularis or thaspi. And another description from Mitchell describes that the clipius convex produced considerably below the suborbital line. So maybe a top
Longer
view
face.
would, yeah, maybe a
Okay.
top view would be good
Yeah.
context.
And I'm not sure. So they're not mentioning the malar space, but usually when you have a long face, and I thought it was mentioned to be quadrangular rather than particularly long, but it may be just produced below the level of the eye. All right,
Yeah, it
I'm going
doesn't
to
really
bring,
say anything about the whole face, just the clipius itself, which
yeah.
may be a different proportion than we're used to.
All right. So problem with digital things is sometimes it's difficult to get a good perspective. But so what they're talking about is if this were, and it's pretty close, you can see dark facial fovea, what looks like, and then maybe light ones underneath. If you draw a line across between the bases of the compound eyes and look at, well, what proportion of the clipius is below that line, this, and it does appear to be the case. So the clipius is projecting out more than other species. You know, again, using this line across the bases and the fact that this may be slightly off in terms of the shot from the microscope is not at exact right angles to the plane of the face. But again, pretty close. You can see that does look like it's sticking out dome-like. Let's just flip it to the side. Recall that we have some famous dome-like Andrena, the most famous being Andrena violae, that really sticks way out. And, this is not as much as violae. Here's the clipius. And, but in comparison to others, I think that's probably true. And it's just one of those relative ones. So the more experience you have looking at these things, the more like, oh yeah, that's different from the other thing I was looking at, but hard to like quantify. And here we have the mandible again. And where is that little tooth? It appears to be not present. Like that tooth should be right in here. And I don't really see anything. Any other questions, Claire? These all have very strong um, ears or cutouts, or what am I looking for? Um, um, they're not the pronotal collar is not smooth. It's I forget what the terminology is now, but basically it's flattened and there's
Humeral
usually a
angle.
ridge. Yeah, the humor angle is strongly present. There's little ears up here, and so but they all have that. So you can look at the facial fovea a little bit there, and yeah, it looks like the upper part's dark and the lower part's light. Less than magnificent specimen. So if there's no more questions, but are there no more questions, Claire?
Nope, don't have any more. Um, you guys want to jump in, or we will wrap up and finish these Andrenas next week.
We can look at Carolina. It's a fun one.
Cool.
All right.
People are saying thanks.
Okay.
Super. Well, we'll see you. Oh, not next week. We'll see
Not
you
next week, right?
in December or whenever. Thanks, Jean. That's true. I'm also noticing, and this is sometimes things want to see. I forgot the subgenus does not have. They have a robust corbicula with no internal hair, so that's a great reminder to show at some point with the females, just in general, a reminder of what that looks like. Okay,
Cool.
we'll see you in a couple weeks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.